few weeks ago, I found myself sitting on the floor of my living room. And what I was doing is I was going through papers that had built up over the years that I was storing in there. Some drawings, writing, magazines, other things like this, trying to decide what I was going to get rid of and keep. And so I'm there for a while, shuffling through some things, and I look up at one point to one of the bookshelves that's above me, and I see all my art books. And I've collected anthologies, monographs, collections of work that have really informed how I see the world as an artist, but if I'm honest, also how I see the world as a therapist. I'm sitting there staring at the shelf, and this book sort of just pops out to me. And it's bright red, it's fairly thick, and it's a favorite book of mine, and it reads in the binding the words, Philip Guston, now. And I reach over and grab the book and start going through it. And I haven't looked at this book in maybe 2 years, something like that. And it's a favorite of mine. I really love Guston's work. And I think you'll see why in this podcast. But at any rate, when I'm going through it, I start to realize how important his work is for the practice of therapy, and especially the existential therapeutic approach that I take with clients. And then it dawns on me, I have to make a podcast about him. That's the obvious thing to do. And so here we are. So the title of this podcast, or the idea that it's circling around, is this kind of concept of risk. What does it mean to take risks? And what does it mean for therapy when we take risks? And where I'd like to start in this journey of exploring this idea of risk in a therapeutic sense is by looking at Guston a little more thoroughly. Because I think you'll see that risk is really woven through his life. So Guston, who is he? He's born in 1913 to a family of Ukrainian Jewish immigrants. And he finds himself from a young age living in Los Angeles. And this would have been roughly in the 1920s. His kind of childhood takes place within. And his early years are marked by pretty profound hardship. His father commits suicide when he's around age 10. And he talks extensively about how he watched the Ku Klux Klan rallies in the 1920s, even into the 30s in Los Angeles. And this was very much part of the cultural backdrop of LA at the time, something which is unthinkable now. And I mention these two things because they will matter as we start to get to know Guston a little bit more. So if we flash forward in his life some, we go to about the end of World War II, Guston has kind of risen to prominence as an up-and-coming artist. He's making these abstract paintings that are made by him often standing very close to the painting's surface, so close that he can't see the whole work, but only what is directly in front of him, just a few inches from the canvas. And he's making these kind of vertical and horizontal marks that are all meshed together to make these kind of patterns appear. And the work is colorful, it's expressive, it's kind of a record of him being there in the moment. And they're selling very well. And by any measure of the word, he's arrived as an artist in the art world. So much so that he's kind of conflated with the abstract expressionist movement that's appearing at this time. And his name gets included in those of like Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, William de Kooning. And so he's making work, he's successful, he's doing all these things. And he has kind of this 20-year period up until the late 1960s approximately of work selling well and him becoming a known quantity. And a successful one at that. And he knows that he could keep going. He could keep going and be an important name historically just for what he has already done. But he chooses to step back from it. And he kind of goes into seclusion a bit. And what he says about this time in his life is that he had become sort of disenfranchised with the art world about what it liked and disliked. And he was very bored and sort of felt like the work he was making was empty. You know, he had discovered that you could make these abstract paintings that people would buy in a very procedural way, in a way that he didn't really feel like he was putting his whole body and his whole mind into the work. It was more like producing something like a factory almost. And he also felt, in a more deep philosophical sense, that he was hiding behind the abstractions, that in a way they weren't really saying what he wanted to say. They were more like blurring out the possibilities that he could express on the canvas. So he wants to take a different approach. He wants to do something that really matters for him and the art he wants to make, not the art that's going to sell necessarily, the art he really wants to make. And he takes some pretty tremendous risks. The work that emerges in this time period, and the first things that are shown to the public after he kind of pulls back, are really different. They're images that are raw. They're messy. They have like half the canvas scraped off and part of it removed, and then he'll put the thing back on. And it's images of things like legs that are tangled together, broken light bulbs, rooms that are kind of crudely lit and rendered in a very rough way. That's marks that are imprecise. It's very cartoonish. And the whole thing is just so different than the work that's come before it, and really the work that anyone is producing at this time. People don't know what to make of this. But he takes even a further risk. And he starts including in these paintings figures, but not just any figure. He starts painting Klansmen, the Klansmen that he saw back in the 1920s as a kid, in those rallies that made him feel othered, that he saw other people getting oppressed by. And he's kind of showing that in these images. But here's the thing he's doing is he's not just projecting them outward and saying, the evil is out there or the problem is out there. He takes and does something different. He starts painting the Klansman as himself. There are paintings of him at an easel, painting a painting in his studio, and he depicts himself wearing a hooded robe. And think about this for a minute, what he's saying here. It's pretty strange. You have a Jewish artist that felt othered by society, that was, trying to say something about that othering in America. He's talking about American violence, and then he chooses to depict himself as part of the problem? What does that mean? What is he trying to say? And what Guston is doing is he's saying, look, I can't cleanly separate myself out from the American project, even if I want to. I'm complicit in some small way in this whole thing. My actions, myself, it's part of the collective, and here it is reflected in me. I'm not going to pretend like I can just push it outside and forget about it. I'm going to recognize that some of that, of what America is, about that problems that are in this country, I also embody. And this is a pretty big shift. Something that hasn't been seen exactly in this way before in the art world. And when Guston shows this work, in the 1970s, early 70s, the first showing where it happened was at the Marlborough Gallery in New York City. The critics did not like it. They shunned the work. They said it was disgusting, appalling. They thought it shouldn't be shown, many of them. Now, of course, there were also critics that understood it and praised it, but the overwhelming majority did not like the work. And Guston could have taken a different path here. He could have said, you know what? I'm going to go back to that abstract work I was making before. I'm going to return to that thing that was safe. But he doesn't do it. He doubles down and he says, I'm going to keep pushing into this territory and see where it goes. And that's really the work that Guston becomes known for the rest of his life, and how he makes the biggest impact on the art world. I'd like to turn our attention now towards a related idea that I think will start to connect the dots here about why this is so important for therapy. And it comes through the existential philosopher Martin Heidegger. And he had this idea called, and this is the German for it, called Das Man. And if you translate that into English, a kind of literal translation would be something like the they self, or just they self. And what Heidegger is talking about here is how in certain kinds of societies or certain kind of social situations, we take on the perspective of the collective, the they. And you have to understand that Heidegger is writing about this from inside of the rise of fascism in Germany. And he's starting to notice how the push towards a collective ideology is making people assume their own agency for that collective and just become the they. And he was watching how people would forget about their own agency, and they would push that aside and say, well, you know, the party wants me to think this way or do this thing, or I shouldn't have these beliefs anymore because it's not what the collective says is okay. And he was watching how people were letting their own ideas just disappear in favor of what the collective wanted. And this isn't a new theme. It's something that recurs through history and is far older than Heidegger. And it's still happening today. We have these kinds of places where we want to not feel the anxiety of choice, of deciding for ourselves in our lives. And so we push those decisions onto what the collective says is the right thing, the right move to make. And we sort of just assume ourselves over to it because it removes a certain burden of authorship over us, a certain kind of weight. But as you can see, I think already the problem here is that what about our individual choices? What about our agency? What about our creative freedom? You know, Guston would have never, ever taken the risks he did if he just followed what the collective wanted him to do. They wanted him to be safe. They wanted him to only make abstract paintings that were, you know, blurred out versions of his life, not the actual specifics of what's in his mind. And they wanted him to stay there. The critics even wanted him to stay there. But instead, he said, no, I'm going to do the thing that I think really matters, not what the collective thinks, but the thing that I believe is true. So now if we start to consider how this might apply to therapy, I'd like us first to look at the rise of manualized therapies. And many of you will have heard of what I'm talking about, although you don't maybe realize what it is. And these things tend to have acronyms. Not always, but they tend to. And I'm going to pick on one right now because I think it's a good example of sort of the problems contained within it. And it's CBT, which stands for Cognitive Behavioral Therapy. And undoubtedly, some of you will have heard of what this is, or maybe even know what it is, or have experienced it. It's very popular. And how CBT it works is, you know, as a clinician, I can go to a CBT training, which I actually have, and you can learn the process. And it's a manual, it's a binder, and it has, you know, whatever, couple hundred pages or something, and you work through step by step what the process looks like. And the sessions themselves, when you conduct them with clients, are very formulaic as well. You start it a certain way. There's a thing you go into in the middle, and then you close always in the same way. There's worksheets that you take with people to work on at home. The treatment plans you create are very specific. They say, this is the client's problem. Here's what their blocker is, and here's how we're going to solve the problem. And there's a whole kind of mechanistic process you go through to achieve the thing the client set out to come into therapy for. And what you see with these therapies is that they have a high rate of success with certain narrow kinds of issues. So you can take, problem X, you apply treatment Y, and you get outcome Z, and it follows this very predictable pathway. It's mechanized, in other words. These kind of therapies can really be broken down into rational logic almost. And that's seductive, I think, because it feels like, yeah, I can do this thing as an individual, as a client. I can just, tap into someone who's a CBT practitioner, and I can have them help me with this one issue and then get the thing I want and then step away from therapy. And many people do this, or at least they do it for a time, I would say. But the thing is, and the place to notice here, is that those kind of more manualized processes, they don't ask the client or the clinician to ever fully risk anything. There's no place where you start kind of coloring outside of the lines, where you start exploring what is really alive and true in the moment. And I'm not claiming here that this happens all the time or that's a full indictment of, these manualized therapies. But I am saying I've noticed patterns where that can happen and often does. And maybe it's not a big issue in the kind of full picture of it because people need that kind of care. And so at a certain level, it does meet people's needs. But it doesn't quite scratch the itch when it comes to deeper levels of change, really fully understanding who we are, or coming into greater contact with what makes our life and our existence worth living. And anytime we talk about risk and what I'm really speaking about, I have to start thinking about the word anxiety. Because underneath this drive towards those manualized therapies, what I think is really going on here is a kind of cultural anxiety about going into the unknown. We want a system to make it okay for us to do whatever we need to do. We don't want to have to sit with the unknownness or the ambivalence or the unsure space of not exactly being, so clear about what's going to happen next. And that's exactly the kind of thing that more depth-oriented approaches to psychotherapy ask of clients. And the practice that, I work in, as an existential humanistic therapist, it's a space of often meeting clients deeply in that ambivalence, in that curiosity, in that unknown space, and sitting with that anxiety actually quite directly. And by doing so, it allows us to take tremendous risks that would be very difficult to imagine in, say, a manualized CBT process. It's kind of like the difference of if Guston chose to make the work he really wanted to make versus stayed safe. He could have stayed in that stayed safe process. He could have just kept making those procedural abstract paintings. And I see an analogy there to processes that are manualized in therapy. They're very safe. They feel familiar. They're known. They're reliable. I can do this thing and get a certain outcome. Guston could paint a certain way and get a predictable paycheck. I could practice some fidelity model to some, manualized therapy and get a predictable outcome. No longer arc of time, that genuine encounter, that thing that really is alive underneath those processes is missing. Guston took those risks to make those incredible paintings that ask us the hardest questions about our own sort of complicity in the societies we live. And in the same way, when we abandon sort of those frames of knowing what's going to happen in therapy and really being with what is present and what is, it allows something sort of beautiful to emerge between me and my clients that can't be ever explored any other way. And I'm not saying this is easy to do. It is some of the most difficult work a clinician can enter into, I believe, because it asks them really to hang in there with the intricacy, the dynamicism, the complexity, the kind of different problems of self and other that emerge. And at least me, from my worldview, it's really worth it in the end. The risks are what matters. Being with anxiety is actually what matters. Coming into greater contact with what really challenges us is where the growth edge is. It's not about always just staying within a box or making sure that we're always comfortable. It's often about expanding that to what level we're able to, and then going in deeper and exploring what's present, what matters, and finding why it's worth to take the risk in the first place. I'd now like to leave you with a poem, a sort of reflection on this entire podcast. I'm not going to explain the poem. I just want you to hear it. The title of this poem is Archaic Torso of Apollo by Rainier Maria Rilke. We cannot know his legacy head, with eyes like ripening fruit, and yet his torso is still suffused with brilliance from inside, like a lamp in which his gaze now turned low. Gleams in all its power, otherwise the curved breast could not dazzle you so, nor could a smile run through the placid hips and thighs to the dark center where procreation flared. Otherwise this stone would seem defaced beneath the translucent cascade of the shoulders, and would not glisten like a wild beast's fur, would not, from all the borders of itself, burst like a star. From here there is no place that does not see you. You must change your life.